Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me. My guest today is Ulrich Baer. A native of Germany, Uli received degrees from two of America's most prestigious universities, Harvard and Yale. After obtaining his PhD in the mid-1990s, he joined the faculty of NYU, in whose Arts and Sciences department he's taught German and comparative literature. He also teaches in the Department of Photography and Imaging at NYU's renowned Tisch School of Arts. An expert on poetry, photography, philosophy, and literature, Uli has authored and edited numerous books to which I'll dutifully provide links in the show notes below. He also hosts a couple of fascinating podcasts, the Proust Questionnaire and Think About It, to which I'll also provide links in the show notes below. Uli, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Daniel, thank you for inviting me to your show. I'm really happy to be here today.
And I'm delighted to have you. If you'd permit me, I'd like to open our conversation with a question or two about photography, a subject over which you have no small expertise. The mission of photography, declared Edward Steichen, the Luxembourg-born American photographer who basically fathered modern fashion photography, is to explain man to man or woman to woman, and beyond that, each man to himself. What do you say the mission of photography is?
I think Steichen says something that's still relevant today. So to explain man to man, we would probably say human to human today, women to men, men to women. To explain how we live in relationship with other people, those relationships can be that we are tied to them, we like them, we're fond of them, we're connected to them, or we really strongly dislike them, and there's actually a kind of break in relations. So I would say being man to man doesn't mean always in a positive way, but also antagonism and the way in which we may be invested in other people's fate and fortune, or actually really work against that, as we can see. And photo has always been, to me, photo has been very much a medium that is in the world, immanent to the world. It is not an outside position that then creates a picture of the world, but it's generated from within the world, by which I mean, I'll say one thing about that, and then I'll go to the other part of Steichen, where he says the relationship of ourselves to ourselves. What I mean by photography being a medium that is in the world, if you think about a painter who sets up an easel or a canvas or something and then creates an image that is maybe trying to be a very faithful, realistic reflection of what they see, or it is a completely imaginary picture. They're starting in a place that separates itself out from the world, that art is here and the world is there. Photography is always in the world, generating from the immanence of our engagement, our immersion, our embodied existence, and then creates this picture. This, of course, is not really true for drone photography, all the automatic cameras, but I'm talking right now about intentional photography, the way we think about photographers. So the painter is, in a way, recreating this possibility of a view of the world from a position that we don't have as humans, which is outside of this world, not immanent to it, transcendent, if you will. That's what art promises. Photography tries to aspire to this occasionally, but most photography is actually not art photography. Most photography is born within our deep embodied engagement already. Most photography has been vernacular. Most photography is citizen photography from the beginning. So I always think of photography as a very democratic, messy, unregulated approach of how we engage in the world. And then the Steichen part comes in. So we engage in the world all the time, but how do we document that approach to make sense of our engagement? So the two of us are talking right now, we're in it, we're immersing in it, but how do we step out of that to think about what is this conversation? What is actually an interaction, etc.? A photo freezes that moment and allows us to step out of it without totally stepping out of it, the way painting would, which I'm now opposing to photography. And then the other part, Steichen, is the relationship to the self. Well, that's when photos speak to you, to somebody, that's a remarkable thing, that something was caught in reality, that someone's gifted eye, photographer who has a great sense of chance and timing, or great technical skill, or very lucky, captured something that reveals more about the world than what we usually capture when we look at it. So the critic Walter Benjamin in the 1930s, who writes a very beautiful little essay called The Short History of Photography, called this dimension that photographs allow us to see more than what the human eye can see, the optical unconscious. He meant very simply, photographs can give you stop motion photography like Moyer Bridge, a galloping horse or something. You can see the movement of the horse. You can actually see that a horse at some moment doesn't touch the ground at all. It was a really scientific debate, but they couldn't tell because it's too fast. So photos slow things down. They can speed things up. They can give you a microscopic view of the inside of a cell or something like that. That's what Benjamin called the unconscious. He says we take that in constantly, but we don't have the mental capacity to process it. So photographs present us with that, and then we have an opportunity to process. If you shift from the galloping horse, the inside of the cell, to the self, I think Steichen would say there are things we don't know about ourselves until we see them photographed. And a simple way of this is when you see a picture of yourself, sometimes you think, oh, this captures me, I look good. Those are two separate responses. One is this captures me versus I look good. One is authenticity, one is vanity. And then there are pictures when you say, this doesn't look like me. But there's a slight suspicion that maybe this is what I look like to other people. Maybe I think I look like this, but maybe other people actually see me in this other way. And one more reference, Freud has a really funny and kind of interesting anecdote. Freud is on a train, I think to Italy or something, and says he's startled to see this old man staring at him through a window. And it's his reflection in a pane of glass. And he's startled by his age and by the way he looks. And he says the uncanny encounter with ourselves as something that isn't totally known to us. Photography can have that effect as well. I guess that's what Steichen means, where I would put the self not as, oh, photography allows you to know yourself really well. It's like, rather, photography unsettles your knowledge about yourself in a productive way. Like, oh, you thought you were this, but maybe you're actually something else.
Oh my gosh, brilliantly put. Yeah, the unsettling feature of photography is one, with which we're all familiar, whether we're taking pictures in vanity, in vain or otherwise. You mentioned a couple of. Mm-hmm.
It goes in two directions. Like also, our culture. We all, we want to be on Instagram and look good and all that. There's this culture. It goes in trends, but for a while, everybody wanted to look good and cute and be on vacation and all that and have a glamorous life. That's an unreality that photography gives you access to. And I think it's a very important one. I think it's fantasy, it's fiction. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think it becomes bad because as we see people confuse that reality with how they really are, there's America has always had this potential to live in its own fiction. So I think Instagram allows people to say, I actually live this life, and you discover they don't live this life at all. But this is a powerful tool for people to imagine themselves otherwise. And that tool has been given everybody practically as a camera now. That tool used to be available to artists and poets and painters and people with equipment. And now anybody can create an image of themselves that is not what they really were taught or told who they were. That's an amazing thing, I think. Therefore, I think photography is actually just now coming into its own, because it's been handed to everybody, not just an elite kind of technical thing.
Yeah, and I want to expand on that idea, the democratization of photography, its expansion to the masses, to artists and non-artists alike. Before I do that, though, I want to comment on two things. First, this idea of one's willingness to be to have a picture taken of him or her. My father and I were discussing this a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about how earlier on, when before the advent of the smartphone, people were so often shy to have their picture taken, right? And I can remember this. You would pull out a Kodak camera or a sort of an early iteration of a digital camera, and so often you'd be at a party and girls would shy away from the camera and the boys would put on goofy poses. But there was always a bit of a hesitation in having one's picture taken. That seems to have gone away almost entirely. Right. I almost wish for a return to a little bit more modesty in our approach to having pictures taken. I think it's just become so quotidian. Pictures are taken all the time of every conceivable thing. that we think very little of it. But it's funny to have come of age during the era of the smartphone as they've developed so rapidly, to know that there was a time when people really were quite reluctant to be captured on camera.
And I wonder whether that kind of hesitation and fear was sort of, there was a part, I don't want to be caught, with food in my teeth or looking goofy or whatever, or the boys were sort of unsure, like what position they're supposed to be. Are they supposed to be, flannel suited, strong men, or like, no, I'm going to be goofy and like, destroy the seriousness of this image. But there was a kind of hesitation. What if I'm captured the way I'm not really to other people? So that kind of like, I'm kind of captured in the wrong way. And also there was a limit on how many photographs there were. So, if it's not a good picture of me, there won't be another one. Then we moved into where everybody has a camera, as you said. And this is a great expansion, democratization. There's also a problem because people have learned new poses or sort of ways of, mugging for the camera. So, it's like, there's all sorts of ways in which people know how to behave instantly. When there's a camera, they turn toward it, like sunflowers to the sun. They're like, oh, there's a camera, I need to be photographed. But I need to be photographed in this way that is kind of the way to be photographed right now. Right. And I don't need to be photographed any other way. And there's a kind of instantly people resort to genres or cliches or forms, which is normal for human beings because we need to live in patterns that are familiar. We can't just invent ourselves every 10 minutes. But there's a bit of a loss, I think, because people are too familiar with how to behave in front of a camera. I like the moment when people were, as you're saying, a little bit unsure. How am I supposed to pose? And I think that's also the moment when the beginning of sort of, not the beginning, but when we have people who really know how to be photogenic. They kind of live into the lens and they kind of have this way of conveying this kind of charisma and aura photographically, and they're called photogenic, but it's a very strange thing. It's probably photogenic is a really modern thing. You couldn't have said to somebody in 1815 they were photogenic. I don't know, Mary Shelley or something with Frankenstein, like teenage superstar, most influential novel for the last 100 years written by an 18-year-old on a bed. Was she photogenic? There was no idea that she could have functioned in a way that her image would move people. That's only comes about with a new technology, which is interesting. So when we say someone is very photogenic, we mean something by that. We don't just mean they are good looking. We say they know how to interact with this medium to make us feel their humanity. And that's a new thing in a way, right?
Yeah. That's a fascinating point. There's a reciprocity in one who is photogenic, as you described it. There's an interaction happening, whether or not it's totally willful or concentrated is unknown to me. Sometimes people just so happen by a gift of God to be photogenic. They need to be told that they're photogenic, right? Some people, models, they obviously know this. They develop certain postures and skills to enhance that quality. But I think it's very charming and kind of innocent to be told, like Mary Shelley might have been told had she someone to tell her that she was photogenic. I thought of another person who might fit in this category, kind of off topic. But Frida Kahlo might be one of these people who was kind of unintentionally photogenic. She was just a beautiful, but sort of a peculiar, idiosyncratic looking person, with a very strong facial posture, but also that unique unibrow. Punctuating her face.
Well, and Frida Kahlo, a truly great artist, a very important painter, and she understands also, in addition to being this artist, what people like Warhol will actually really deepen in a really very deep point, that you can become known for being known. That, celebrity for its own sake, which I don't think is totally empty. We can tend to say, oh, it's, it's like, the Paris Hilton phenomenon or something like that, who I'm sure are very hardworking, creative people. But go back to Frida Kahlo. She becomes known for being willing and able to show herself in this very, what we today say, unapologetic, almost confrontational way. There's something a bit confronting or a bit off-putting. She's not quite letting you in, but totally taking you in. Say, look at all of me, but I will also put all this symbolism around me, have the monkeys on my shoulders, have this, have these flowers, have these, patterns. So there's something about being totally invited in, and she's still saying, I am still myself. You don't own me totally. I don't hand myself over. And there's that status of the celebrity who's both, ubiquitously accessible. We all consume these images constantly, but they're a little bit removed from us. I think that's what's interesting about a Kahlo, she's on every coffee mug, you can put her on t-shirts and all this stuff, and she's an icon for all sorts of things, but she's not quite ours. She withholds something, right?
Yeah, surrounding her always, eternally, is a certain mystique.
Yeah.
And I think that's amazing. It's an impenetrable mystique. Yeah. I think the young women today posing on Instagram might learn something from her, right? I think there's too much exposure in many cases.
Yeah.
And getting back to what you said about the candor of a subject and sort of the naturalness or the posed presentation, it's my decided preference that I want to see more candor in these photographs. Like you said, we all are too polished in our how should I say? Whenever presented with the possibility of having a picture taken of us, we're just far too polished, men and women. We know exactly the quarter angle to which we should turn our heads in order to have the best, light shining on that half of or that quarter of our cheek, and the smile or the pout or the raised eyebrow. And there's too much of an insistence on perfection in photography. What I prefer. And I think what a lot of people want to see again is more naturalness, more candor, and I think when that's seen in photographs, it's just it's comforting, I think, and it solidifies that connection that you spoke about earlier.
And it's what you're describing. I wonder, Daniel, it's hard to get to though, because when you're saying candor or naturalness, as soon as it's in the in the camera, it's hard to say, like, how do you capture that without rehearsing that as another trope? So what I'm saying is, doesn't authenticity and naturalness become as rehearsed as real naturalness? There's a moment, I think there's a kind of story by the German writer Heinrich von Kleist, who's a romantic writer in the 1810s or 20s, and he says, whether pain is simulated or real makes a huge difference. But it can be simulated so well that we don't know the difference anymore. So that authenticity can become a pose. And he uses pain as the example, which you would think you cannot even emulate, but it matters to us whether something is, as you said, natural or not. So in someone who says, I'm the master of the disheveled look, and I have my tousled, bed hair, and I just woke up and I'm smoking my cigarette and I'm not even awake, and that's authenticity, right? That's James Dean all the way to like some contemporary actors, like that's Timothy Chalamet. That's authenticity. But that's so quickly through to photography, because it's such a fast, ubiquitous medium, becomes another pose. So photography is kind of interesting because, like, when you see a picture that speaks to you with that candor, I think it's worth staying for a moment and say, what speaks to me? Or what do I find interesting? What do I find that's not totally rehearsed? And I'm not saying cliches are bad or these patterns are bad. They are what they are. We recognize them. They're sort of, conventions. But when does candor actually stay true to itself and is still captured for other people to share, right?
Right. So we get toward a place of contrived naturalness, paradoxically. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating point.
Well, and look what we're going to live through is, like, we will not have even to practice anymore to look to the left or the right. We'll just have a camera take 1,000 pictures, in a couple of seconds, and then AI will pick the best one. And AI will pick the one that has been the most attractive to most people who in my demographic will like me. And the problem with that is it's really great. It saves a lot of time. So every commercial will be super effective, every ad. The problem is that it can only really reproduce cliches. Very subtle cliches, but it cannot really, and you can tell AI, come up with an original, never been seen before way of showing a photograph. And they're going to say, well, who was the most radical photographer who did photo collage and cut stuff up or, blurred things out or, so let's get there. But the game has become a bit harder, I think, now to sort of not to turn candor, naturalness, etc., into another pose.
And now one of the consequences of cameras in the smartphones is that the art of photography seems to have been lost. If not totally lost, it's being forgotten. Like an iPhone demands of its user no knowledge of ISO, shutter speeds, f-stops, aperture, lenses, angles, and
Right.
so on.
Right.
But even many professional photographers equipped with high-end digital cameras have only the faintest appreciation of all of these features. You walk up to, your workaday wedding photographer using a Panasonic camera like that on which I'm recording this conversation,
Right.
and he might have a smattering of information about the camera, but really might not understand it the way a true artist or a
Right.
true photographer from years past might. So do you think that photography is at risk of becoming a lost art?
It's going to go through a transition. Yes, some things will become a lost art. Some things, the kind of technical knowledge, the way people can manipulate an image in the darkroom or through exposure, etc., through all these technical aspects, that will be lost or just be another filter you just click on and it'll just achieve that and have this effect. But new things, I think photography will survive in the way that people still have to take compelling images. So I have a lot of students who used to be able to take 20 images or something like that, or 24 or 48 or 100, but it got sort of expensive. Now they take 4,000 and they've just started. It's only Monday morning, and it's 4,000. And so what I try to teach them is, how do you turn 4,000 images into 8 images, each of which tells the beginning or the end of a story, each of which has to contain things that are not totally obvious, that you don't just take and you've got all the information, but something in the picture has to be in tension or in some kind of abeyance, meaning it's not resolved yet. That makes for a compelling image. Otherwise, you don't look at it for more than a half second. Otherwise, it's just documentation, which is important and fine. And you can document when you're selling, beds or coffee cups, you need to just document. But if you want to tell a picture of a coffee cup that was meaningful in some story and you're doing something else. So the editorial process becomes much more important than before. Before, you created a moody image of the Flatiron building and it was misty and, and it's kind of, there's fog and everything, and the technology allowed you to capture that fog. And so great, you have that shot, and no one had it before. Now you can do that in 10 seconds or in 1 second. But does this picture say anything? That is the editorial function of the human eye, which we keep on picking out information, editing out information, centering information, putting it in the periphery. That process, I think, will have to grow much more because there are too many images. So which one are you going to look at? Why would you look at it even for more than 1 second? Why would it start your process of thinking more? By which I mean, does it launch your desire to understand something? What I'm saying is a very high bar. It's like a picture that would strike you in a way or stun you, not necessarily because it's traumatic, but say, whoa, I've never seen this thing from this angle or in this way. What is going on here? It reawakens sort of our sense that the world is yet to be understood. It's full of wonder, full of things we can't understand. And the analogy could be, when Turner painted, the British painter who painted seascapes and all that, he had to mix his own paints. And there was a moment, which I can't really date, but I should, look it up at some point. It's quite interesting, when there was a sort of trade war between France and England, and they couldn't get a certain kind of blue. And you can know that from a certain point on, the pictures contain this kind of blue, and before or after they don't, because this blue was not available. And what we know then, he used this to mix his own colors and all that. That's what photographers had to do with their cameras. They had to know all this technical stuff. And now painters go to a store. People still mix their own paint. Painters do, but there are so many options that are prefabricated. You just pick pretty much any shade in the universe that used to not be available. They couldn't just go to a store and say, I want to have every shade of red or something like that. So I think photographs are going to stay and going to become, the good photographs are going to stand out more because there's so many more photographs. And the bad photographs are just going to be stuff we live with. They're just sort of the illustration of our world, which is just ubiquitous, and we just scroll through it. And, if you scroll through Instagram, what picture makes you stop for a second? There's the what, Emily Dickinson would call the little anodynes, like the things that numb us. What we stop is it's sexy, it's titillating, it's provocative, it's shocking, it's soothing, it's comforting, it's familiar. All of those things, okay, fine, like I stopped for a moment. But then the other pictures, and I stop and I don't quite know why I stopped. I don't quite know what it appealed within me. So that is the picture that interests me. It's like, wait, why did I stop here? Why did I, like, it's not just, this I get because I like tropical birds, or I like, being on a beach or something like that, or I love food or whatever, or I love football.
Right. And that can provoke questions about oneself. Okay, why do I like this photograph? What is it about this photograph that is appealing to me? And also about the photograph itself, right? Like, what happened to this photo? What drama is being played out here that I'm interested in, that I'm curious about? I want to reply to a few things that you said. The one fascinating thing that you said about Turner and his use of different hues of blue,
Right.
Depending on the relations between France and England at that time, and the difficulty with which one would have to create these colors. Like you said, the ease of paints and different artistic materials has never been this way. I reflect back on a recent conversation that I had with the art historian and Michelangelo scholar William Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned as I was preparing for that interview how laborious a process it was to paint fresco. It was a process that would require almost the entirety of a day. Artisans or assistants to the expert, in this case Michelangelo, would have to awake early in the morning, begin mixing the colors, and Michelangelo, of course, would have his sketch prepared, but the window of time during which he would apply that to the wall was very limited, right? And of course there's the drying effect, and there's a time at which the paint is just right, and the water, everything is just right for the application on the wall, to make this fresco. And then as soon as that window is closed, it's closed, and there's no going back, there's no editing on the computer. What's done is done, right? So I think when you're dealing with film, there's something similar, right? My girlfriend is now very much into film photography, and it takes some discipline to use film photography, as you know, because you have a finite number of shots. So we're in the city of Philadelphia just a few months ago, and everybody else is snapping away on cell phones, and she's very strategically lining up her shot and looking at the Liberty Bell in just the right way in order to make best use of this precious photograph. And I just find that so commendable. It's such an amazing way to approach the world, and it's something hopefully that you're able to teach your students. I would think in coming to you, to the Tisch School of Arts at NYU, they probably have that approach to photography. Maybe they don't. Is it the case?
A lot of them do, actually. It's quite, I want to say something about the time your girlfriend spent trying to pick a shot. Like, she's sort of standing there and sort of picturing all these people with their phones snapping away, just like, the iPhones. And then she's thinking, what's the shot? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is this going to be the shot? I have to wait, the light's going to be like this. Hold on. Like, can I run into the middle of the street for this moment, stand there? Well, all of this. What she's doing is what you said, Michelangelo, he's painting a fresco. There's only this moment, but all this preparation and all this thought in this human lifetime, your girlfriend spends 5 minutes on a picture that you would spend no time on, and Michelangelo spends 5 hours. But what they're doing is they're sort of, in a weird way, relating also to time itself. So if you think of Michelangelo, which is just remarkable that this work has lasted so many hundreds of years, has sort of spellbound people for so long. It's mesmerizing, it's remarkable, but it sort of works against time. It's not a human product that is used up the way you make a pair of shoes. At some point they're worn out, you gotta throw them out. There's stuff that we use, and that's like the way the world is. We consume our own creations. Art is not that. We create something and it's supposed to outlast everything. And photography is really interesting because photography is really a medium that works with time as much as with the visual world around us. It's a photography it's a medium that's entirely time-based. It's about the shutter speed and all that. So what your girlfriend is doing, sort of to slow that moment down a bit, to maybe make a photograph that will last longer than its normal duration. And I think this relationship to the world, to sort of say, I want to capture a moment that will outlast itself. When Cartier-Bresson says, sort of like the, the sort of this, the lucky moment, this kind of the capturing these perfect moments, they're supposed to outlast not just this moment, but time altogether. They're supposed to be in a space that's sort of suspended. They're not just in the past, they're not just in the future. They're sort of, we don't really know what they mean. The perfect moment is this kind of suspended, like there's a famous photograph, like someone leaping over a puddle. He's reflected in the puddle. There's like a kind of circus in the background. That moment will never happen again. And we don't quite even know where he lands. Does he land in the puddle? Does he make it across the puddle? All this stuff. It opens up something that is not knowable, rather than it opens up the future as the continuation of our present in predictable ways. So I think that photography is the medium of time itself. And film is really interesting, film photography. The other question would be, that I don't know really much about at all, is how film relates to this. Film as a medium, which also plays on film. The critic Roland Barthes said he doesn't like film so much because it always showed him the next picture he had to look at. Whereas in still photography, he could sort of plunge into a photograph and get lost in it. In a film, it just would move him along. And he didn't like that so much. And he wrote that in a book.
Yeah, the viewer is more passive in that regard.
Absolutely. And he wrote it in a book where he wanted to hold on to time. That book is ultimately a meditation on his mother who just passed away. And he's trying to find a photograph that captured his mother. And quite movingly and quite famously, he wrote a whole book about this picture of his mother in the winter garden. And he never shows the picture. He says, this is what my mother really looked like, but he doesn't show it to us because you can't show that. Because, of course, his mother was meaningful to him in a particular way. And photography, so he has this private photograph. So it's about, I'm holding on to memory against the loss of the way we pass through time.
Yeah, it's almost like the face of the divine, not to compare his wife to God.
Yeah.
But there's something similar in that it's so sacred and personal and intimate and yet transcendent to him that it can't be so easily shared with others.
And the nice thing is, I think you're totally right. It is transcendent, but photography, as I said in the beginning, it's in the world. It's off the world. It's not, I mean, your girlfriend may be, shooting the sunset over the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. This is the emanation of this of divinity, but it's really not. So,
yeah, and you preempted my comment, which was to tie together the idea of immanence with which you started this conversation, and that of transcendence with which we were now dealing.
And it's interesting to me what you're saying. I think there is something, it's the promise of something greater than what we are. And photography, weirdly enough, connects us to that, which is a kind of timelessness within time. That time can be halted or stilled, and we can deepen our experience of it. And we have those experiences. I don't think we can have them all the time, but we have them. And photography maybe is one way to access or remind us that they exist.
Now, naturally, after our visit to Philadelphia, when we returned to Florida, we had to have these pictures developed. So we went on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, we went to Wynwood in Miami, kind of an eclectic, hipster-esque type of place.
Right.
And I think you would really enjoy. And there on the main street is a store for the development of film. And it struck me that an entire storefront, in an expensive area of Miami, would be dedicated to development of film. And yet there was a lot of foot traffic going into and out of this store. I was absolutely delighted to see it. I sort of have my own ideas about this, but do you think that there's a kind of like a simmering nostalgia for something real, something tactile, like a photograph, a physical photograph, in this age of mass digitization? I'm
picturing the store with like swinging doors, like a dry goods store in the West with wooden planks, like there's like dust motes in the sunbeam. Is that what it is? Like you walk into a movie set full on?
Not movies. I wish. It was next to a taqueria, taco stand, and it actually had an interesting display. I forget its name, but it had an interesting display on the wall of a Ducati motorcycle, kind of disemboweled. Yeah, it was kind of like an artsy place naturally.
Yeah, there is nostalgia, and it's like nostalgia is sort of perhaps not quite the right word, but there is a kind of trend against the sort of the general acceleration of life, that everything is too fast, there's too much information coming at us, the availability of information, data, etc. We all know this. It's cannot be surveyed anymore at all. No human can even think to read all the books on. You cannot even read all the books on Virginia Woolf practically in your lifetime. You can maybe read all of Virginia Woolf, but you cannot even. So this is strange. So there is a movement away from that, and I think the great parts of those movements are, I hope they're not nostalgic, going back to the way things were in a kind of slightly filtered, screened out way. Like people used to have these great lives. I'm like, no, they didn't have hot showers, they didn't have penicillin, etc. But rather, where will we go with too much information, a lot of leisure time, actually, that work will be automated to a certain point, and what we want ultimately. So we should look at, what do we crave? What are we missing? And that is human connection, for sure, I think, because people all know that the phone is not exactly saving the world. Feeling alive from within ourselves rather than from external stimulants. You can go to the Super Bowl, you can go to a Era's concert for Taylor Swift, you can feel in a crowd in a kind of very produced spectacle, but how do you feel alive from within yourself? I think people are craving that, and I think that should guide where am I going to go? Like in some ways, your girlfriend sort of saying, I'm going to slow myself down deliberately in a kind of strange way, because it would be much quicker, and someone's going to say to her, like, wait, what are you doing, chica? Like, just use a regular camera, and why are you spending all this money and driving all the way to Wyndham to get this developed? Because I think the thing is to keep on thinking, what do I want out of this? I don't just want to be the weird person with an old camera because it looks cool, but something is maybe lost, but maybe we can find a new thing of being, like something new. You know what I mean? Like back then, if you had given Steichen an iPhone, it would have blown his mind. Or Ansel Adam would have probably said, like, oh my God, in a LiDAR camera, that would have been nice in Yosemite. I wish I didn't have to carry this big thing. So I don't want to go to nostalgia is, not go back. Like, let's go forward with all this stuff and see what can we do. I think the camera is a good example. Like getting an older camera is one way to slow ourselves down. I think slowing down is really strange that we crave that, right? We want to be sort of slower when everything else tells us, no, faster, get there, do this, achieve that, get up in the morning, do your 10 push-ups, drink water, meditate, do your list of things. Like all this self-help stuff I read is to maximize our contribution to society as good consumer citizens and all of this. And I'm not, if you've seen, I'm not a super political thinker in this way. I don't like these kind of slogans, but is this really what I get up for in the morning to maximize my potential? No. But maybe I do wake up to think I would like to feel alive today and grateful for my life and deeply appreciative and not have to look for someone else to tell me how to feel about that.
Huh. You described my morning exactly. 10 push-ups, a glass of water, chewing on rosemary, and walking bare. No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely, 100%.
Meditating, for exactly 3 minutes, not a minute more, and then.
And I look in the mirror and tell myself that I love myself, all of that. But I brush my tooth with the left hand to rewire my brain and my neural pathways. All these routines. But the routines are not
fluoride-free toothpaste.
I don't want to mock the routines at all. I think part of my commitment and part of why I'm a teacher is also to say, let's slow down and say, what do you want? Because we're so confused about what we want. I'm confused about what I want. It's like, actually, okay, I don't have anything against all these rituals. I get up, do my push-ups, do all this, drink my water, all this, eat my rosemary. Good. For what? what are you missing, or what could you feel, or what could you have that you don't have right now that apparently you are looking for? So that's actually the question that is more interesting to me. And I think this question has to be answered from what do I want from within myself, within my life, within my community, etc., rather than it'll be given from me from outside of that. This is my only take on politics in a way right here, that politics, institutionalized systems of thinking promise you, we're going to give you that meaning. You'll find it by joining our cause. And that is very seductive and can be incredibly empowering, and has brought together some of the greatest social movements in history, and can also be the way to stop thinking. It's groupthink par excellence. So this is, I think, sort of say, what do you want when we do all these great rituals that we learn from TikTok, and how do we happier people, right?
If there's a recurring answer to the maladies of modernity, a recurring answer that I've heard from multiple guests with whom I've had the great fortune to speak, it's that we have to slow down. Just recently, I had a conversation with Joseph Pierce, who's a Catholic, I would call him a philosopher, certainly a writer, a prodigious writer, prolific writer. And we discussed at the end of our conversation a philosophy of walking. And I referenced Henry David Thoreau's famous essay, treatise on walking. He referenced an anecdote involving a couple of great English thinkers, including C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So I'm just combining the two pieces of advice that I received from you just a few minutes ago and from Joseph Pierce a few weeks ago. Might be, yes, to slow down, but maybe also to slow down while doing something physical, while being engaged in the world, walking, for instance, while having slung over your shoulder a proper film camera with which you can take very deliberately and consciously a photograph of the world and kind of document your experience of that day as you look back and develop it. So yeah, that's something that I've noted multiple times with these, you included, the great thinkers and guests with whom I've had the good fortune to talk. Do you have any other comment about that, about slowness as an approach toward living? I think you covered it very, very eloquently.
I generally agree, because the world is so, like our modern American world is so sped up and so accelerated. So yes, slowing down in a way. And I think, however, your question is really great. I really like this question. And when I think about it more, I think find the stillness within activity. So I slow down. I'm also a very impatient person. I do a lot of things. I can't sit still. I hate walking slowly. Like, I'm very impatient in a certain way. So, but I think it's okay to do things fast, to run, to do whatever, to really do, like, speed is exhilarating. But in that, be fully aware that you are moving fast. That would be slowing down in a way to say, I'm in this, rather than I'm running to get to this next place. Like, say, I'm running and I'm really fully aware that I'm running. So it's the awareness which has to be slow or stilled in a way of the activity I'm in. So I'll give you another example. So, I practice Shaolin Kung Fu, and I'm an eternal student. I'm terrible at it. I totally suck. I cannot remember any routines. I'm bad. And I have this amazing Shifu, who's a 39th generation Shaolin monk. Shifu, Yan Ming, so he's a major teacher. And he said a couple important things to me. He said, one thing, he said, Uli, you have too much language in your head. You need to do action meditation. And action meditation is this super hardcore Kung Fu. It's really fast. It's really insane. You can't really even think. You can't even breathe. It's so hard. And in some ways, he said, I'm going to slow you down by making you go so fast that you can't think anymore. So, he taught me how to do cartwheels. And I'm not exactly a gifted gymnast, but I learned how to do cartwheels. So I'm very tall. So my center of gravity is really, so it was hard. And I couldn't think about the cartwheel to learn it, but I had to do it. And when I was doing it, I stopped thinking, and I was doing it fast, and it was really hard. It was super exercise class, but I felt I was actually slowed down, because all I was doing is trying to do a cartwheel. And in that activity, my mind wasn't racing. I think the slowing down is your mind shouldn't race. Your mind races all the time. You can do things really slowly. You can sit on a velvet pillow and meditate, and your mind is racing. Say, gotta. Like, that's not what it is. And meditation is not, oh, I'm going to go to sleep. It's to be fully aware of whatever you're doing is what you're doing. And that could be fast or slow. So it's not walk slowly. It's like, no, get your camera, go on a goddamn hike, like, go really hard because you have to get there today. It's going to be exhausting. Like, you want to make a 22-mile trip today. You better get up early, get going. So I feel it's the slowness means our mind has to slow down and not process everything right away, but has to sit within itself, so it's actually really helpful because in some ways I sometimes think, oh yeah, doing things slower would get there, but slowing, I'm just like, I think about more stuff. I do it more slowly. I'm not even focused anymore. So it's more like being aware of yourself while you're doing it.
Okay. So being very mindful of yourself and of your activity, despite the speed at which you're performing that activity.
Yes. The speed can be, you can be a race car driver. Fastest thing on, whatever. You better be fully present doing that. If you're going, I don't know, hundreds of miles an hour, you're flying a jet plane, you better be really aware. That means your mind has to be very deliberate and slow.
Now you confess you confess in your biography on your website, as you confessed just a moment ago, to being a perpetual beginner in the Shaolin Kung Fu.
Yes.
Which I think is very humble of you to admit.
Honest.
I stand in awe of even being anything in Kung Fu. That's an amazing achievement, in my opinion. Let's focus away from the Shaolin Kung Fu and toward being that perpetual beginner. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Now, in his letters to Merlin, one of the great authors about whom you've written prolifically is Rainer Rilke, and he advises his friend to resolve to be always beginning. I just love that sentiment, and I drew a connection between his advice to a friend and your approach, whether deliberate or otherwise, to Kung Fu. So tell us, what is the mindset of a perpetual beginner? Is it healthy to have this mindset, and how does one adopt himself or herself to such a mindset?
Well, it's first of all an openness to our own limitation, that even if you're very good at something, you could possibly be better. That's it. So don't think, okay, I'm good, I've mastered this. And I'm talking about not skills you need to get through the day, how to use, a car, something like that, but how to be the best in what you do. That means there's always room for improvement. Don't settle for good. Best is available. So you could be an amazing piano player. I'm sure you could do better. Like, that is being a beginner. That's always something ahead of you. So Rilke, when he talks about it, be always a beginner, there's one part where it's self-serving, because Rilke has these amazing women he's in relationships with, and then he always says, well, I don't totally want to commit because I'm a beginner. This is all new, and something could be new and something could be new. So these women were fine. Actually, we have most of their testimonies and letters. It sort of worked. She just had several relationships. But the other part is, he wants to say, to be an artist, you have to be open to the world as something you haven't yet understood, because art is not just the representation of what's out there, but your engagement, you're making sense of your experience of it. And for that, your experience has to be rather fresh, rather new, rather unrehearsed. If it's too rehearsed and follows patterns, then you're just going to, sort of produce existing things. So this perpetual beginner, and for me, I have the great fortune, I'm, tenured faculty member at New York University, which is an amazing and incredible privilege and honor. And that means no one really tells me anymore what to do, more or less. I mean, I show up, I do my responsible things, I teach my classes and all that. But I teach stuff that I don't really know. And I tell my students that, and I say, look, I tried to do my best. I taught a class last year on the invention of American literature, and I taught Native American poetry, about which I really know nothing. But I said, look, but I have some skills, which are research skills, and I know how to access a library and understand what's valuable information was maybe a little bit more tangential. So I will do my best. But what I actually really think they got from those 3 classes is that I was trying to deal with something that really struck me as something remarkable that I couldn't quite make sense of. And that is what I wanted to convey to them, more than I'm the expert, I can explain it to you, and you're done now, and you have my understanding. What they got is, this guy actually has a couple skills, and he has accomplished a couple things, but he's looking at this because maybe he could learn something new. And that is what I think being a beginner is, that there is something yet to learn. And other things, I hope not everybody's a beginner. I don't want my doctor to be a perpetual beginner. I don't we want all sorts of expertise. This is not an attack on expertise. This is not that, but this is about openness. And even my doctor, I want my doctor not to be a beginner, but I want my doctor to be open to new ways of treatment and to keep up with the research and to go to conferences and learn things, because I don't want them to say, I'm done. I'm done. This is how I treat the flu, and this is it. Like, no, right. Science is a really good example for this, because in science, we don't think people are beginners, but of course people are in a way beginners, because there is an always receding horizon of knowledge. It's not like we figured this out. We know how the gene really works, or we know how a cell really operates. We don't actually. There's a mystery in it, and that is what the beginner sort of tries to get in touch with, not like new frontiers always, but yet within something already understood, there's still things to be discovered.
Yeah, I understand the beginner to be he or she who approaches all things with a spirit of humility. And I think in that way, yes, even your physician who is operating on your appendix can still be a beginner in the poetic sense, so long as I don't hemorrhage internally. In that case, right. It's not there's nothing right. Poetic about that. Right. But I understand it to be someone who has that spirit of humility, that childlike curiosity, that childlike, conception of the universe in which he or she is a very small part and is just entering upon. That's how I like to understand a beginner, and I really appreciate your explanation of that as well. I want to ask you, how do all of these interests of yours tie together? Is there a thread that links your love of poetry to that of photography, to that of philosophy, to that of kung fu? What is it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that I have an answer, which I only figured out in the last 2 years or so. And the answer is that I think there's a way to choose one's life, affirm life from within life, by which I mean you can actually commit to being fully, consciously, and in a vulnerable way alive, or you could choose not to. You could choose to live your life in rehearsed ways and sort of become comfortable in who you are, and you achieve things and you have all the trappings of that, and you are sort of in relationships that people know you. Or you can say, I'm going to try to be in relationships where I'm constantly surprised by the people I'm in relationship with. What Oscar Wilde says, if you want to be in a serious relationship with somebody, you better be ready for a lifelong conversation. So you listen to your friends and you're still struck by what they say, rather than, well, of course she's going to say that because that's who she is. So to choose life over life, and I'll say this, it comes out of my reading of a couple of books. So I spent a lot of the last couple of years being a total beginner. And I have to say, I also do it out of not just because I'm such a great person, but I like actually being in fields where I'm really not invited, not authorized, and not even probably welcome. So I've written on Hemingway and Virginia Woolf and Jane Eyre and Mary Shelley, and done podcasts on Martin Buber and Kant. And this is not my specialization, okay? I'm not in the philosophy department. I'm not in American literature. And I have friends who say to me, I don't really quite know what their attitude is like. So you're not even a scholar of American poetry. What are you doing writing a book on Emily Dickinson? And I think I'm responding to something in Emily Dickinson or in Virginia Woolf, where these people try to find a way to affirm being alive from as I said, within life, and not by referring to an outside ideology or perspective, not to a greater political cause, not to the cause of justice, not to hand themselves over to a greater belief system, but to say, from within myself, I will generate something that makes me feel more intensely alive. I think Woolf wrote Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, not to reinvent the novel and sort of create a new way of storytelling or something like that, or to become famous, but she felt she wanted to sort of give voice to this experience of feeling very awake. Very awake. And there are moments in these books, there are passages, and you think like, whoa, it's kind of brimming. They're sort of luminous. She was touched by something. But like Walden writes, Thoreau writes Walden. In the beginning, it's just like your Home Depot shopping list. You know, what are we going to buy? Nails and this and that. And you're like, okay, we went to Home Depot with some. And then there are moments in the book where he's sort of by himself, and you're thinking, he's really after something, which is just to feel totally alive there when, you know, the leaves fall, whatever. And there are moments when it works in that book, and you think, this is the reason he wrote this book, to give that to us and to say, you have this capacity and you have to activate or sort of cultivate this. And the mystery is, to me, what I just say, there are these moments when you can be fully awakened to life, you know, through an experience of beauty or another. Yeah.
And do you think all people are susceptible to those moments?
The mystery is that we are probably all capable of it, but that we have to be awakened to it, which is really strange. It is a human quality, but it's not, we can live our lives and never experience it. So the big question is, can you cultivate this, which is what a lot of self-help literature, which is really wonderful, says, like, you can cultivate this. I'm not convinced, but it's a strange thing. You can cultivate it, or what I'm describing is actually being struck a little bit against your will. The way in which we suffer the passions, like strong emotions, like you're struck by something. You're really struck. And there are moments when that happens, and it's not because I was really today in my best Buddhist mode, you know, fully awakened to the world, but actually I was struck and ripped out of my normal way of being and stopped in my tracks. This happens when we see, you know, the experience in which literature is cast this always because it's relatable, is the moment of being struck by somebody we'll fall in love with. It's a very powerful moment, and you can, I'm sure people can explain it, and my colleagues probably explain it through some kind of dopamine, like whatever kind of chemical levels in the brain. That's not what literature is interested in. Literature is interested, what happens to us in time at that moment when we feel something momentous just happened just from within my life. So I'm really interested in that, and I think it's worth looking at that and cultivating that, because we were so tempted and we're so distracted from this to our own sort of, you know, detriment.
When were you last struck by a moment like that? Not falling in love, but a moment of pure awakeness or wakefulness?
Well, no, I was struck. I don't think I fell in love. I was struck last night. I had a conversation with somebody, and there was this little exchange about something, and I don't know, it was about Valentine's Day, and we were sort of joking, and it was so unexpectedly enjoyable to talk. It was just like, it went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and we both just started laughing because it was so in sync. We were just like, wait, we're like, we gotta get a drink. Like, it was just weird. It was just a weird thing. It was just beautiful and weird and totally unplanned and rehearsed. And we both were looked at it like, what? And it was just like, and in some ways that can happen. And I liked it also because it was totally contingent. It didn't have to happen, didn't happen. We didn't attribute too much significance to it or something like that. So that happens. So yeah, that's the last time I think when that happened. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And it was funny because we both didn't even know what to do with it. We're like, okay, what do we do now? Like, get married? And I was like, no, probably not. But hey, this was, we don't even know what it was. Yeah. The other moments when I can give you probably more, like more.
No, that's okay. I don't want to pry too deeply.
Like literary moments when I was read a passage in Erasmus or something. Exactly.
Yeah. Unbosoming all of your deepest
Yes.
moments of your life, right? Like Montaigne, yeah, right?
Exactly.
No. I was just curious to know, and as I ask that question, I'm reflecting on some experiences that I myself have had, and oftentimes those moments.
What's been an experience for you? What's been an experience like that for you?
So when you described this sort of blissful moment of uproarious laughter, stimulated by maybe the most trivial thing, it reminded me of a recent conversation that I had with this same girlfriend who's always taking her time taking these pictures. It was similar. We were on the phone and she said something goofy and I just started laughing, or I said something, I don't remember who said the goofy thing, and it was just laughter. And at that moment you realize that you are in this relationship, rather romantic or otherwise, with a really important person. In your case it was this friend, in my case it's my girlfriend, it could be with a parent, an uncle, whomever. And you're just sharing in this moment of sort of unguarded bliss. It might only be for 30 seconds. You're just laughing together. You don't know why, but you know that your jaw's starting to hurt, or your ribs are starting to get into stitches. And it's just a beautiful experience that you want to repeat again and again. And hopefully everyone can find someone in his or her life that can provide that joy. So like you said, there are a lot of experience. I try to be a very mindful person.
Right.
So I try always to live with wakefulness in everything I do, whether it be running this morning, doing my 10 push-ups, or having this very conversation with you.
Right.
I'm trying to be absolutely present, and it's a good practice to do that, to immerse oneself entirely in what's happening, and you will achieve over time these feelings of utter wakefulness and connection.
And I think there's some part, I want to say one thing in a minute about this kind of connection with another person, but there are things one can do, and especially in this time right now when the news are very overwhelming for a lot of people, I think there is something to surround yourself in very modest ways by things that actually do speak to you. That if something makes you happy, like there's something about when you look at artist studios, a lot of times they have these kind of walls and it's like their Pinterest, basically they have all these pictures because it speaks to them, and that's important. And there's a way to surround yourself and to spend more time actually doing something, which I think we go back to this slowing down. Like I spent the last year reading Emily Dickinson in the mornings for about 45 minutes. I can't read more than that. After 45 minutes, I start to get distracted and I don't know what she's doing. So, and that is a deliberate activity, but it has the effect sometimes that I'm kind of very struck in these poems. I'm sort of in these poems in a way, and my mind is in a different place, and it's very beautiful. But sometimes you can be intentional about it and surround yourself with that rather than, I think we all do this. I live in New York, so most people, we walk a lot and we don't drive a lot and we stand a lot in front of buildings or elevators, and everybody stares at their goddamn phone. And I literally have a lunch or a meeting or a conversation or a lecture, and then everybody talks. And the same people who just had an intense conversation go into the hallway and then stare at their phones, and they don't continue the conversation. And so you can put yourself into situations where this is much more likely to happen. And I'll say one other thing about what, when you were laughing with your girlfriend, sort of this moment, the poet Anne Carson has this beautiful book called Eros, E-R-O-S, Eros the Bittersweet, about the poet Sappho. And the book is very beautiful. It's about Sappho's poetry, which is all fragments. And she says at one moment, the experience of falling into the shaft of time, of falling into timelessness, is what is the experience of love. She says it is also, interestingly enough, for her, the experience of understanding a poem. But what you described with your girlfriend, or what I had with this person, who was not my friend, actually, that person someone I just met, which was why it was so kind of beautiful. And like, what the hell? Like, we don't even like. Okay, what
he's
is
your friend now?
He's my friend now, for sure. Exactly. Where's my friend now? But we said it's like as if you're in a moment and you're not in time. It's like this is beautiful. this isn't going to lead anywhere. We don't want to build on this. This is just happening. And we're sharing a moment that's very unusual. We're really sharing a moment that is happening to the two of us. It wouldn't happen to one of us alone. It's shared. It has to be co-constituted. Some people felt the political theorist Hannah Arendt, she had those moments when she talked to her friends. She really said for her, they were as intense as erotic encounters. I had a podcast and I interviewed the late philosopher Richard Bernstein, who we really miss, who said his first meeting with Hannah Arendt, he was a really young scholar, was the most erotic night of his life. And I said, Richard, tell me more. And he said, I was like, really? And I said, yes. And he said, we talked till 2 a.m. And she was the only person who ever talked to me who wanted to find out how I was thinking rather than what I was thinking. And I said, why would you call it erotic? He said, because we were so close. And there was such an intensity of actually talking to somebody. It was really beautiful. So this can happen between people. This can happen with other, I'm sure with nature, etc. People have these experiences. But I think you can put yourself into more situations where this happens rather than fewer. I think that's the choice.
Hopefully you don't describe to this individual with whom you had this exchange. Hopefully you don't describe that exchange as having been erotic. You might have lost that friend if you did as quickly as.
Who knows? Who knows? Yeah, no, it's amazing. Yeah, I wouldn't use that word. Like, it's sort of, I'm an academic. Like, I wouldn't use the word erotic in a non-academic sense without having to footnote it. It's Anne Carson. It's not the way you think it is. It's not about sex. It's actually about intensity. I don't expect.
Now, that idea about falling into that shaft of timelessness, is that taken from the fragmentary work of Sappho, the lesbian, in the truest sense, in the real sense, the lesbian poetess, or is that from the author?
I think it's Anne Carson, but it may actually be out of another. I'm trying to look whether the book. It was maybe out of another philosopher, Isocrates, maybe. I don't know who she uses. So it's in the middle of the book, but
it reaches back toward a Greek thinker.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a way of, if you think the Greek philosophy, so when Plato and Aristotle, philosophy starts with wonder, right? At awe at the world. Everybody knows this. Wonder is the beginning of philosophy. What she's describing, this experience is not the beginning of philosophy, of the inquiry into the world of knowledge, of this kind of activity. She said it's just timeless and it doesn't connect to this next step. That is actually not philosophical. You fall into time. You fall into this moment, and there's no philosophy that comes out of it. So this experience of, which we're talking about, which can be love, but doesn't have to be limited to romantic love or something, a kind of a deep kind of confluence of minds. It doesn't lead to anything. I feel Hannah Arendt, to invoke her again, she would say it takes you out of the world. It removes you from the world of relations, of social life, of politics, because you're in a timeless moment, and that is not what the world is. The world is our engagement with reality. So it comes out of a pre-philosophical tradition in a way, like Isocrates, or these people who are not yet the Platonic tradition, who posit there is this experience of wonder, then we build philosophy on top of it, and this entire metaphysical superstructure.
And we can link this idea of timelessness back to our conversation about photography and the influence of that artwork.
Absolutely. And photography, it's funny. I teach photography at NYU, and people ask me a lot when I meet people, like, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "Oh, I teach in a college." And they said, "What do you teach?" And I say, "I teach photography. I teach photography and poetry. They are two separate subjects. And I don't teach it together." And they say, "Oh, do you teach courses on literature and photography?" I said, "No, I don't. I actually don't. They're, to me, distinct the way two moments in time are distinct. They're not, oh, this happens in poetry, this happens in photography. They're different ways of they're different ways of dealing with that."
Yeah. Are you ever tempted to kind of interpenetrate the two?
Not really. No, not really. No, not really. No. It's funny. They're sort of separate to me. I don't really know. They don't even mix in my mind, I feel.
And how did these two passions develop, going back biographically in your history?
I wrote a dissertation a really long time ago, and part of the dissertation was on the French symbolist poet Charles Baudelaire, who's very famous because he made sort of unsavory topics into the topics of poetry. So death, prostitutes, beggars, debris, all these things that French high literature wanted to disregard. He turned it into Les Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of evil. And he was a Catholic poet who turned sin into something. So this is the 1850s, 60s. So it opens up what we call today modern literature, which deals with all parts of life, not just the glorious parts of life, the beautiful ones, but also the ugly underside, etc. And in that work, I discovered these photographs of Paris by this photographer, Charles Marville, in the 1850s, who's the first person to be able to photograph the sky and the city below us on the same print. Until then, they couldn't do it because it would either overexpose the city or underexpose the sky, because you couldn't capture the clouds in it because the exposure wouldn't work. Until the 1900, people would just glue together a shot of the sky with clouds and the landscape underneath, because you couldn't capture both. The cameras wouldn't do that. When you look at 19th century photography, everything always looks really bleak to us. It looks really empty and bereft no matter how many people, because the sky is blank. And we feel it's really literally the sky is blank, which for us means there's no heaven, there's no transcendence, there's no luminous presence there. And then in the 20th century, there's clouds and all the stuff happens above, although they've been disenchanted. That's a whole other story. So I discovered these photographs, and then I wrote 10 pages in my dissertation. And one of my best friends, Eyal Peretz, who's a philosopher, he took me out for a beer and said, "Uli, I have to talk to you." And I thought, what is going on? Is this going to be a really serious conversation? He said, those 10 pages on photography, they don't really belong in this book. And I said, okay, that's fine. And he said, what? I said, okay, fine, I'll take them out. He said, I thought you would be upset. I said, no, I don't care. I'll take them out. I didn't care at all. I was like, okay, if you say they don't work, that I trust you. He's much smarter than I am. I'm like, I trust you. So I took them out and wrote a second book on photography. And that was the beginning. And the other beginning, I really want to credit my teacher, Esther da Costa Meyer, who taught at Yale University art history. And she gave me an assignment to work on photographs in 19th century Paris. And I wrote a paper, and then I turned it into a much longer project. So it was sort of motivated by a discovery in an archive, and then this essay I wrote in graduate school. And then I started working on photography.
And then after that academic experience with photography, did you pick up photography as a more practical art? Did you begin purchasing cameras and using them and experimenting with them?
No, I mostly teach really how to tell stories through photography. So my classes are sort of considered the history and theory of photography, not the practical side. So I don't know a thing about f-stops and things like that. But I have some skill in looking at a picture and asking somebody, say, what did you try to do here? Do you think this is working? And I don't think this part is working. So I write about photography, and the technical part is, I don't really have good photographs. My photographs are like they're the level of my kung fu.
So is that it? So is photography? So is photography, like kung fu, an activity at which you plan to be a beginner at any point?
I didn't plan. I wish I was better, but I just don't get there.
Well, I want to turn. I mean, there are just so many topics, and I love the fact that we've been able to get through the lion's share of them. But it would be remiss of me not to get some of your advice on great books. As I've listened to some of your excellent episodes of your podcast, Think About It, I've been struck by those which deal with the great books. So in brief, for those who are listening who haven't yet listened to your podcast, Think About It, what is a great book?
So a great book, so I do this podcast on great books, and they're books that say something about our human experience in this world with other humans and the environment that outlasts their own telling. So they are stories that in some way have either an explicit allegorical dimension. So they are the battle of good and evil, or the loss of innocence, or the villain, or those kinds of tales that are kind of perennially important paradigms of human existence. So they could be explicitly an allegory. So it's not just about this person losing everything, but it's about generally what does loss mean. But some of those books actually just keep on being renewed in the sense, and the example I had earlier of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is a science fiction novel meant, it's supposed to scare people. It's a competition she has with her brother, and so she says, like, who writes the scariest story? Then she writes this novel. So the story is a scary story about the sort of subjugation of nature by science that's happening in the early 19th century. The disenchantment of the world, that there's no longer magic, but everything can be understood. The mystery of life itself, that we could maybe recreate it. The beginning of technology, electricity, channeling, harnessing electricity, there's all these things. And then it becomes a book for actually the male envy of procreation, that it's about male arrogance, that Dr. Frankenstein actually wants to give birth to this creature, about the cruelty of humans who will subjugate somebody who doesn't look like them to terrible treatment. The only reason we don't like the monster because he's unattractive and ugly. He has a heart of gold. He's the warmest person. Then it becomes a story about how literature. So I'm giving you so many readings that one book contains so many readings that become really important. So there's a scene when the monster, who's never called the monster in the book, the creature, learns compassion by listening in to somebody, the blind person being read stories to. So he learns from literature, from Milton, etc., the literature of the day that also Mary Shelley had learned, in her household with Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, like really illustrious philosophers and people. And that then is a question, can you in the 19th century educate the masses, the peasants, the workers, and teach them how to be good people? Is morality actually taught through literature, not through the church? That's a huge discussion for secular modernity. So Frankenstein, a book like that, contains these stories that can be turned into a simple question. Is secular literature the way to teach ethics, for example, when before that it was clearly religion that taught us how to be moral beings? And that's in one story in Frankenstein that's part of a longer story, also in a very captivating, dramatic, exciting story. So I feel a book that's a classic doesn't answer its own questions, but somehow hits on questions that become maybe more urgent much later. And Frankenstein becomes more urgent after, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of the possibility of destroying not just entire cities and murdering hundreds of thousands of people in 5 seconds, but actually destroying the planet. That is unleashing technology. Frankenstein is the parable for that. So that's one book that gives you so much. And then there are other books that appeal to people, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen is, 5 women and they have to get married because they will not inherit their father's home. Do you marry for love or for money? It goes all the way to The Bachelor today. And it goes all the way to each one of us. How much am I willing to actually give up for true love, or how much do I think love should actually be, sort of also, some material consideration? Jane Eyre is 50 years later, Charlotte Bronte, and it's the story where actually she makes a choice not to marry for money and really to marry for love. But that's 50 years later. Elizabeth Bennet sort of doesn't have really those options. So, and it's not that today all people have that option to just marry for love and material conditions aren't there, and you can get out of it easily and all this. And like, look at our rules of marriage and divorce are really strange. The state regulates all of this, and you would think, why does the state even have anything to do with this? So I think books that contain, as I said, questions that are not answered by the book itself in a way, and told in a powerful way, meaning told in often through storytelling or the originality or innovative way of using language that is resonant, that resonates past its time. So it's not just a journalistic article about people are facing the fact that they can't get married unless they have money or something like that, but it's wrapping it into a story. And we are storytelling creatures. We tell ourselves stories, so stories speak to us and we put ourselves in them.
Yeah.
That's only 3 books out of, I think 60.
Well, it's astonishing that you selected those 3, because those 3 perfectly align with 3 that I might have chosen.
Really? What would be your book you think as a great book?
Well, perhaps I was primed by the earlier reference to Mary Shelley.
Right.
When we were talking about a photogenic young woman.
Yeah.
So perhaps she was just on my mind. But I would put forward exactly that book, I think, Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, is about as nearly perfect a book as one could hope to find. It again is an instant classic. Everything about it is so perfect. I love the way in which it came to be, to which you alluded, right? The competition between Byron and Shelley to produce a kind of a horror story of sorts. And she's in the midst of these famous writers, radical writers, right, who are really unwelcome back in England, and they produce between the three of them the work of the vampire. I think it was the doctor of Byron who was visiting Italy with them, or sojourning in Italy with them, who produces what would become the vampire stories, right? So the kind of the story outside the actual story is, to me, just fascinating. And the story itself touches upon all of those themes that you just outlined. And it's accessible. It's not an extremely long book the way that Jane Eyre is, or Middlemarch is.
Right.
It's accessible. It's digestible. You can give it to a gift to someone who isn't too much of a bibliophile, isn't reading too much, but is curious to start reading great works. It's a perfect entree to the greats, to the classics. The story is compelling, right? The action is amazing. The moral is so rich, and of course, the prose, the style is unbelievable. And then of course the story moving beyond that about Mary Shelley and how how she came to her end, right? So it's just like everything within the story is amazing, and also surrounding the story is enthralling.
Right, the story of the creation of the story. What you just said about style. So I was very fortunate. I studied with the late Harold Bloom, who's much missed, who was one of the great literary critics, who I think edited 600 books on different books, and wrote a book called The Western Canon, which got him into a lot of hot water because of the canon wars. But in any case, Harold Bloom said, and you just said about styles, he did cognitive originality, meaning someone who's thinking of something in a different way or in a new way that people hadn't quite thought about. Stylistic innovation. And so stylistic innovation is told in a really beautiful way. There's something new, maybe, so it's captivating. It's not just the sentences we've heard before. And then he says aesthetic splendor. There's beauty in it. He said those three categories. So cognitive originality, so it has to be original, told in a new way, and it has to be beautiful. And beauty doesn't mean it's beauty, just there's no ugliness, but beauty is that, which is an important part of, I think, a great book. It has to appeal to something that's not just cognitive. That we're not just like, I got it, I figured it out. This is a morality tale about this, and you shouldn't marry, or you should marry for love, or whatever. Like, that's not it. There's beauty, and beauty is it's what the great poets say. It's it outlasts something. It could be that beauty is truth, beauty, as Keats said, and Rilke says 100 years later, beauty is terrifying, actually, because it disdains to destroy us. It's greater than us, but we can take it in, but it's sitting in front of us, and we're never quite as beautiful, of course, as true beauty, as a beautiful thing or object. So the experience of beauty is for us very kind of shattering, like it's intense, because the sentence is really remarkable. It disdains to destroy us. Because beauty could overwhelm us, the beauty of the world, if you think about the universe, something like that. So, but I like Bloom when he gave these three criteria, and then he said, and of course, ultimately, it is me who will decide, Harold Bloom. This book is great, and this one is not so great. I don't have that kind of. I don't have that.
Ultimately, he's the arbiter. It still is much.
And people ask me a lot of times, can you tell a great book? And my students said, you have to read a lot of books. Read a lot of books. It's like going to the theater. I have friends who teach at Tisch who are, directors, acting teachers, actors. And I said, how do you know? They say, we go to so much stuff. And then after 10 minutes whether it works or not.
Yeah, and the same can be said for great literature. Although we're giving you, the listeners out there, sort of an express lane toward great works. Of which you named three. So yeah, absolutely. Frankenstein is high on my list of great works. I want to end with one question. Now, you've written a lot of introductions to many classic works. Do you feel as though you're in some sort of generational communion with the authors to whose work you're writing introductions?
How do you mean that?
You're right. The phrasing of that question is maybe not the best. What I mean is to say it's a daunting project, I would think, to write an introduction to Friedrich Nietzsche's work, or that of Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
Unparalleled geniuses of their ages. Not to say that you're not an unparalleled genius of your age.
Really not. But anyway.
But it would be a tall task for anyone to do this.
Yeah.
So do you try to have some sort of a conversation across time with this author, with this artist, to say, hey, like, I'm coming to you and to your work as a great fan, as a critic, as a scholar. What would you want me to say? How would you want your work introduced to someone who may have never seen it before, who have maybe never, experienced it?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel this is my role, and this is sort of, I assigned myself this role. No one gave it to me, and and to say, okay, how does this work resonate today? I have a different sensibility. I'm this person. I kind of explicitly locate myself in the 21st century. I'm not a timeless critic who just says cognitive originality, aesthetic splendor, and it has its timeless, eternal. I actually am not Harold Bloom in that way. I write very much and say, from a 21st century perspective, this book speaks particularly to this and this. These parts of the book don't even resonate anymore because this is not a topic anymore. Or this is actually by now a totally different question that makes part of the book almost unreadable to us. So I think my role is really to sort of say, and there's a little bit of a, I have a little bit of a sort of, savior complex. I okay, I want to rescue a few of these books because they have been under attack, not just by sort of, conservative, book bans because they are supposed to be, somewhat illicit or too upsetting or something like that. They're also under attack from the left for being politically incorrect. So part of my job is to say, okay, do these books still speak to us, or do they actually say things that we cannot accept and therefore must shut them down? So I think a little bit of my job is this kind of how to navigate through these two pressures from the right and from the left, to be really good about it and say, how do these books stay with us? Because they still have things to say. Plus, and this is my sort of, maybe it's a kind of nice point to wrap up on, I do think we're living in a world where sort of our capacity of imagination, our imaginative capacity, our inner world is constantly diminished or impoverished by the fact that there's way too much outside stimuli, that we are not spending a moment sitting still but looking at our phone. So there's never a moment of silence in us which would allow us to tell our own story on our own terms, to actually think about who we are. There's no little silence. I mean, I know people who really never leave their house without their headphones. It's always there. I produce podcasts, so people listen to them, but that's having someone else's voice. And I think these books actually are a way for you to be with yourself in a very strange way. There's a very strange effect of reading that you can start to think about yourself. And when I teach, very rarely it happens, but it happens, and it's very moving actually, when a book does what Ralph Waldo Emerson said, what great books can do. And they say they can become a commentary on your life. You're no longer reading the book to understand the author, to know their wisdom, to see what people thought about, but they become a commentary on your life, how you, Daniel, are living right now. They speak to something that you are trying to figure out. And you say, this is helping me figure out what I want to figure out about my life. Then a book is an amazing thing. So I feel this is my way, and they have to be brought into the 21st century. They don't just sit on their own. Nothing in culture survives without that work. I think I'm a critic, I'm a handmaid, and I'm a servant to these people in a way, but without that, these books don't survive. Nothing survives because it's flooded by information from all sides. So you would never know what's good or what's not good unless you had these people like me doing this, I feel. And I feel this is really just a service. I don't do it, to be the Hemingway scholar, but I feel without that kind of work, there should be as many introductions as there can be. Of course, mine is the best, but otherwise,
I agree. I agree.
Hemingway, I'm sure would agree.
Yeah, oh yeah, undoubtedly. Whose house I visited a couple of years ago, yeah, and I can just sense that he would agree with you on that.
With all the cats, right? They have all the cats.
All the cat, yeah. There's those six-toed cats. Oh yeah,
Yep.
they're very friendly, very amiable. Um, just bringing us back from the sublime to the somewhat profane. I picture you as the kind of the Luke Skywalker figure. I forget on what planet, as the two walls are closing in on him from from the conservative right and the progressive left, and you're there in the breach trying to keep them open and keep the great works flowing to us as they always should. So Uli, thank you so much for the time that you've given me today. Of course, I will link all of your podcasts and all of your books, and the books that for which you've written introductions in the show notes below. It's been an absolute delight to speak with you on a diverse array of topics. I approach conversations like these with scholars like yourself as that perpetual beginner, just totally open-minded and hopeful of learning something. You'll notice that I'm scribbling notes.
Such a wonderful conversation, like such a fun conversation, and I'm really happy you invited me on your podcast. I think it's great what you're doing. I think it was totally fun, which I think should be the requirement for every podcast episode ever recorded in the history of humanity, that it should be a fun conversation. This was really great.
So this one certainly meets that criterion. So to everyone listening, I thank you so very much. Please, of course, subscribe to the channel, share it with friends. And until next time, I fare thee well. I'm Daniel Finneran, and this is Finneran's Wake, signing off.